Welcome to Wellness with John. I'm John Peters. I'm a therapist who's been in practice for 25 years, working with thousands of patients. And this channel is about my sharing a wide variety of wellness tips to help you thrive. So, today I'm going to talk about my background in terms of my longstanding and complex interest in issues related to religion and spirituality and mental health. And I'm making this video because in other videos on this channel, I want to refer to my background, but I don't want to go into it because it's kind of complex, as you'll see if you want to watch this video. So if you're interested in my background, stay tuned. Okay, so as I mentioned in the intro to this video, I would like to make some videos for this channel related to the topic of religion and spirituality and mental health, because there are lots of different things you can talk about in that domain. For example, is it okay to pray in a therapy session, right? So topics like that. And I want to put some context out there so that people have a sense of who's talking to them and why I'm talking about these things. But as you'll see, if you're interested in this stuff about me and you watch this video, it's kind of a long story. So, the short version is I'm 55 years old. I've been interested in the intersection of religion and mental health since I was in kindergarten. That's the short version. But I'm going to give you the long version. And feel free to skip this video and go to other videos if this doesn't interest you. But if you want context in terms of my long and evolving path in terms of my interest in spirituality, religion, and mental health, stick with me and I will explain it. So, chapter 1. This starts actually 2 generations in my family before I was born, because at the time of my birth, my family had been involved with my parents' level and my grandparents' level in a religious cult. And so I was born into the situation where my family was very highly involved in this cult. My parents and my grandparents were central figures in the organization, had prominent roles. And so I was born into this family that had a very, very high involvement in this. It was a fundamentalist Christian cult. And so from an early age, unfortunately for me, I suffered a lot of emotional and psychological and physical abuse because of the toxicity and dysfunction and wackiness of this particular group. And, now I can say, yes, my interest in religion and mental health started then, but it was driven out of a lot of pretty severe suffering on my part and witnessing the suffering of those near me as well, in the name of God, So I saw from a very early age that people who were fundamentally very good people, I believe that my members of my family, most of them, we're all very, very good people, and yet doing very wacky things and very abusive, damaging things to me and others because of their identity and because of their specific commitments to a particular version of being religious. And so I'll tell you that it did not cause me the type of existential crisis that I think this causes in some others, because I was born an atheist, and even from a very early age, like kindergarten years, I didn't buy the descriptions of God and Satan and things like that, because it seemed to me that when those around me were invoking either God or the devil, they were really explaining common human experiences and common human foibles, right? So even as a little kid, when I saw someone like being really mean to someone and then that person reacted negatively, and then it was explained that the negative reaction was because of the devil, seemed to me, no, they were reacting because you did something stupid and mean, right? And so to me, the explanation of invisible beings that we can't see to explain things that there actually are pretty simple explanations to didn't cause me to be particularly religious in a theological sense when I was young. But in any case, the other part of this problem too was that those around me who were professing to be the most religious were also the most abusive people in my life. So I didn't actually believe, even when I was little, that if there is a good religion, if there's a good God, that would mean that the adherents to that religion and worshipers of that God would also be the meanest, stupidest people on the planet. That didn't work for me. So in any case, so I grew up in this situation, and I'm not going to go into the whole story because that would take us hours. But I was beaten and psychologically abused in lots of ways when I was young, unfortunately. And so this resulted in me being more anxious than I probably would have been, even though I came from a family of people who were all somewhat anxious anyway. So I kind of got the anxious gene. But I was a real anxious. By the time I was a teen, I was very anxious. I was depressed. I had severe stomach problems. I had severe headaches, severe back pain. And so for me, chapter 1, in terms of resolving that, was get my driver's license and drive away. So, my first crisis was people in the name of God are abusing me. It goes on my whole life to that point. And so I'm going to solve this by escaping. So that's what I did. I sold stuff that I owned and bought a car and drove away. So that's the end of chapter 1, but there's more. Okay, so chapter 2 starts in my teen years. So I got away from the direct abuse that I had grown up with in my family. But I was very depressed. I was very anxious. I was not as happy as I later would be. And I was not sure what I wanted to do with my life because things were in disarray. Those of you who came out of really chaotic, abusive childhoods know that, you don't have the vanilla kind of story that a lot of more typical people do who don't suffer a lot of abuse. So, I was trying to figure out what I needed to do with myself and not clear on like a career goal or even actually the goal of staying alive at that point, really. But as a teen, because of my experiences, my attitude toward religion in general was pretty negative, pretty hostile, because I didn't blame God for this, but I blamed religious people. And I thought that at the time as a teen, that being religious meant you were at risk of being harmful to those closest to you. That's what I had learned when I was a kid. And if religion can do that, then it shouldn't do that. That's a fundamental flaw with religion if it can cause such extreme harm. And so I basically had generalized anger at all people on the planet who are religious because I didn't want that type of risk to exist, right? So I was not very nice to religious people. I wasn't respectful. But that's part of my story that I'll get back to here in a minute. But I also realized for myself that I was anxious, I was depressed, I was unhappy. I was doing dysfunctional, reckless things to deal with my trouble handling my emotions. And so I wanted to find a way to be healthier. And I started doing a lot of exploration, reading, and taking classes and practicing. And I started doing yoga. I started doing Tai Chi. I started exploring different forms of meditation. And I was doing a lot of reading. So I've always liked reading. And by the time I ended chapter 1, by the way, I had read the Bible back to cover more than once, right? At this point in my life, I've read it cover to cover probably about 7 or 8 times. But I had read the Bible by the time I got out of elementary school, cover to cover. And so I was familiar with the Bible, but I also was just interested in and intrigued by how religion can evolve to be what it is in all its complexity, including the part about it affecting identity and affecting social relationships and affecting us all the way down to the individual, like it had me and I saw others. And so I was doing a lot of comparative religion reading. And in my teen years, into my 20s, I read literally hundreds of books on religion. And I started going to the university. I was a triple major: philosophy, psychology, and religious studies. And so I was taking classes, which gave me an opportunity to read even more books about religion and philosophy and psychology. And so I continued to study intellectually, but also to practice. And one thing I found for me phenomenologically in terms of how certain practices affected me was that doing yoga and doing meditation and doing Tai Chi felt good. They felt supportive, nurturing, healing. And the practices that I started exploring at that time were worth much more to me than any therapy I have done, to be honest. And of course, that may sound strange as a therapist because that's what I do for a living, right? But those things were actually better for me and my mental health than talk therapy. Although I did group therapy when I was younger too, that was very supportive. So I'm reading all these books and I'm exploring these practices. And two types of religion actually were very intriguing to me, one of which was Hinduism and the other was Buddhism. And Hinduism was interesting partly because that's where yoga came from, but also because, in Hinduism, there's all these different versions of the divine, of gods. And part of what that means is that there's this acceptance of different views of what divinity is. And that was affirming for me because a lot of the abuse that I experienced that when I was young was justified partly by this theological idea that there is exactly one concrete, naive view of God, and there can be no variation in that interpretation. And so Hinduism was interesting to me because it fundamentally says there are just a trillion ways to view God, and they're all valid, right? Not in the same ways, but there are multiple valid ways. Also, Hinduism was the thing out of which I was learning yoga and some forms of meditation that I experimented with when I was younger, yogic meditation and Kundalini meditation. And then Buddhism was interesting to me because, the fundamental idea in Buddhism is that the fundamental human problem is that our human existence is characterized by greed, anger, and ignorance. And so basically, the goal is to don't be too selfish, don't be mean, and be wise, which was the opposite of what I experienced when I was young and surrounded by people who were selfish, who were stupid, and who were terribly, terribly mean and abusive and damaging. And so, to have a religion, I put quotes here because, the people quibble about whether Buddhism is a religion or a philosophy, but to have this thing say, don't be selfish, don't be mean, and don't be stupid. That to me was deeply affirming. Also, and you may not know this about Buddhism because it's syncretic with a lot of animism and other types of religion in different cultural contexts, but Buddhism actually doesn't posit the existence of God. It doesn't say that there is no God, but it doesn't, unlike Christianity, with which you might be more familiar, which posits, yes, there is a God, and here's a way to understand God. Buddhism actually doesn't really concern itself with saying, yes, there's a God, Also, Buddhism, unlike Christianity, does not emphasize faith. In fact, supposedly, the Buddha said before he died, the man who became the thing we call the Buddha, apparently he said, or at least it's attributed to him, don't have faith. Faith in anything, including me, will just cause you to be misguided in your spiritual progress. So again, the meanness and abuse I experienced when I was young was partly driven by, you must have faith. You must have faith in this particular thing. And then here I encounter Buddhism, which says, don't have faith. Faith is actually not going to be a good support of your spiritual progress. And if you have faith, then you're likely to be deluded, which I had already learned by the time I was in kindergarten. So Buddhism became interesting to me partly for those reasons. Also, even though I had come into the practice of meditation personally by studying yoga, what I started studying also early on and continue to practice to this day is Zen meditation, which is a form of Buddhist meditation, right? So I started practicing Zen when I was really young and have for now decades. And so to me, meditation then, even though I subsequently learned through a lot of research and reading and practice and talking to people and working with people over the years, a lot about how meditation affects our mental health, and I'll say more about that later. But for me, it was this instant ability to access a form of practice that was healthy, as opposed to the toxicity I had experienced earlier on. And also, it was nurturing and supportive. And it was the forum in which I worked out a lot of my own inner stuff, right, that I needed to work out in order to make sense of myself and the world and my place in the world and my history, right? So meditation ended up being something that, to me, turned me away from my dysfunctional practices and toward more affirming, healthy types of practices. So that's chapter 2. Chapter 3 is I continue my studies and I eventually decide I'm going to be a therapist. And I decided that at one point because even though I wanted to stay in school forever and took a 10-year scenic route through my undergrad, I thought I should just grow up and do something one day. And so I decided I was going to be a therapist. And I decided that partly because I had overcome a lot of stuff. In my 20s, I did a lot of personal work. And I thought, I've gotten through such hell in my life. And I should pay that back. I should be of service, and I should guide other people through their own hells. And I should get paid for that too. And so being a therapist is a way to have a career, a profession, and to actually get paid to guide people through all of their various personal hells. And so I had this idea that because I have been through such suffering myself, that perhaps that means that I'm going to be helpful to others. So I decided to finish my undergrad degree, finished up in religious studies, and go to grad school. So I enrolled in a Master of Social Work program. And around that time, too, I had started to get more interested in socially engaged religious practice. So for me, at that point, it meant socially engaged Buddhism. And I got involved with doing a lot of reading about socially engaged religious practices. So, for example, if you're familiar with Dr. Martin Luther King, that he's an example of someone who promoted socially engaged Christianity. Because, he said, when we're marching at Selma, we're not just marching for civil rights, we're actually being the church. We're worshiping. That is the most fundamental aspect of worship. And in fact, if we don't march at Selma, we're not good Christians. So, that's a theological position that then works out a version of what is socially engaged Christianity. So in my studies about what is religion, what can it mean for people and groups and societies, part of what I was interested in was socially engaged religious practice, partly because I care about my world. I care about myself. I want to have I want to be a good person, to be true to my values. I want to promote good things in society, in the world, in communities. And I'd become a social activist around some various political issues around this time too. And so I got involved with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship and the Zen Peacemaker Order. And so these are groups that promote socially engaged Buddhist practice. And it both is like a forum for people to practice who are activists who also practice contemplative practices. It's also a way to work out what does it mean to evaluate social policy, for example, from a Buddhist perspective. Like, is that law kind or is it mean? Is it stupid or is it wise? So socially engaged religious critique of society. But we also did practice. So, I was a political activist from an early age in lots of ways. And when I got involved with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, we would do things like go to political marches and political events and literally just sit down and meditate. We just sit there and meditate the whole time. So you've got all these people like on bullhorns giving speeches, people chanting and marching, carrying signs, and you've got this group of people who are sitting there in a circle meditating, So we wanted to contribute what we could contribute, and it was an interesting experiment I did that for like 10 years. And I'll say more about that maybe in another video. But in any case, this chapter includes the fact that I got interested in socially engaged practice and was studying to be a therapist and was interested in how I could develop into a therapist who practiced mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, because I knew that was a thing before I decided to go to school to become a therapist. I was very interested in how mindfulness could interface with therapy. I was also interested in how, therapists could be competent in terms of respecting clients' religion and spirituality, right? And again, for me, that was a way to move into a healthy mode as opposed to my early teen years where I just thought all religious people are stupid and they should stop being religious and then we'd all be more okay. As a proto-therapist, I wanted to be a therapist who actually was not hostile toward religious people, but supportive, which makes some sense just from a practical standpoint, because in the United States, about 90% of people say spirituality and or religion is somewhat or very important, right? The Gallup poll has been asking that question since 1965. And in no year did less than 83% say that it wasn't at least somewhat important in their lives, even though it doesn't say how it's important. But if I'm a therapist, basically, I'm going to be seeing clients where a significant portion of them have spirituality and religion as meaningful parts of their lives. So to be a competent therapist, I ought to find ways to engage with my clients, including clients who are religious and spiritual, and who want those to be strengths that are supported in therapy. I ought to be able to do that as well as possible. So in my grad school years for my master's degree, then part of what I did was study how can I be a competent therapist and support a diverse population of my clients who probably have lots of different ways of being spiritual and religious, and some maybe not, but I want to be able to understand that well to be maximally respectful of that. One aspect of that too, which I'll talk about in another video, is just that I think religious people probably think we therapists in general are hostile or negligent regarding issues of spirituality and religion. And so I wanted to correct for that by being a competent therapist, but I'll come back to that in another video. Okay, so in the next chapter, John graduates from grad school, gets a job at Catholic Social Services. So I got this really cool job. Not cool in terms of good pay, unfortunately, but it was exactly the kind of job I wanted. I wanted to work in an outpatient mental health agency that served diverse clients for a diverse set of issues so that I could get the maximum good, broad clinical experience at the beginning of my career. So I got this job at a Catholic Social Services. Now, I am not Catholic. I'm not Christian. but you didn't have to be Catholic or Christian explicitly to get hired here. And in fact, while about half the staff were Christian, um, most of the staff weren't really a lot of extremely strong practicing Christians, I'll say it that way, in terms of like going to church every day and being kind of more explicitly Christian. There were people who lived the values of Christianity, but were not proselytizing and were not preaching, But in any case, that's not true of all Catholic social services. It happened to be true of the one where I got hired. So I get hired at this Catholic service agency and worked there for 5 years. And part of my education there, in terms of the topic of this video and becoming increasingly knowledgeable and competent in dealing with issues of religion and spirituality, part of the reason I got that was that we had people coming to Catholic social services expecting to get Christian counseling. In fact, the phone would ring and our secretary would answer and they would say, "Do you do Christian counseling?" And she would sometimes hand the phone to one of us to answer the question. That can mean a variety of things. I might make a video on that question as well. But people, thought that we were A, somehow Christian, B, competent with Christians wanting Christian therapy. And so, it was an interesting time to learn more about the expectations of people in terms of how people want religion or their own spirituality and religion to relate to both the reasons they come to therapy, the goals that they have for coming to therapy, and the process within the therapy sessions. And so, that taught me a lot about how to be more competent and more broadly respectful to people as a person who can meet people where they are and be supportive and respectful of religion, rather than saying, let's just all pretend like therapy is some sort of a-religious and we all hang our religious selves at the door when we walk into a session and then put that mantle back on when we walk out the door after the session. But during a session, it's not going to be a factor. And that's just a weird, impossible stance intellectually and in practice to take. But I learned a lot about like, what do we do instead? If we're not going to do that crazy thing, how do we deal with people and meet them where they are in terms of religion and spirituality? It was also an opportunity for me to continue my work in being respectful of diverse religious ideas, not all of which are real highly resonant with my own necessarily. But a fundamental question is, does it have to resonate precisely for therapy to work? The short answer is no, but I'll give you the long answer in another video later. But in any case, so I worked for 5 years in this Christian counseling service. And during that time, I decided that I wanted to go back to school. I decided to get my doctorate. And so I enrolled in a doctoral program and began my doctoral work, which I did for 4 years. And at the same time, I also became an adjunct faculty member at Indiana University. So I started teaching in the School of Social Work, mainly grad classes, and I started teaching in the undergrad program of the School of Public Health. And so part of the reason I mentioned this in terms of this overall project that's the topic of this video is that in my doctoral work, I used that because I went to school for 4 years and got, a lot of doctoral education that included the opportunity to read more books about a wide variety of things. And during my doctoral work, I got all but one class away from a master's degree in religious studies. So I had an undergrad in religious studies, and then I almost had a master's because if I'd taken one more class, I would have had a master's. And then my external minor in my doctoral study, my doctorate was going to be in social work, but my external minor was in religious studies. So I was studying religious studies classes again, and I had 2 areas of focus. And one was this more focused topic of how does mindfulness practice relate to clinical therapy work and outcomes, but also number 2, what is socially engaged religion, and how do religions sometimes, not always in the same ways, but how do religions define social identity and social goals in society in terms of what an ideal society should be, and then promote ways for people who identify as religious. How does it promote their social justice commitments. So I know that's a little complicated, but that was my interest, and that had a lot to do with what was going to be my thesis. By the way, the short end of the stick here is with my doctoral work is I eventually decided I didn't really want a doctorate. Even though I finished all the doctoral work, I just didn't turn in my thesis. So I'm not Dr. John for that reason. I didn't finish my doctorate. But because I started teaching and I taught for 15 years at Indiana University, I taught all these grad classes to master's level students who were going to be therapists. And it was another opportunity for me to engage with my students in these complex issues of being competent in terms of becoming therapists who can competently serve religious people. For all the same reasons that I mentioned, I wanted to be competent. My attitude was my students ought to want to be competent for those reasons and eventually should be competent in the ways I want to be competent. And so we discussed in the classes these ideas related to what does it mean to be a therapist, to deliver services, and to be competent in terms of respecting religion and spirituality. So I had this opportunity to do that for 15 years, taught like 40 of those grad classes over 15 years. And that was really rich for me to continue my own research and edification and readings and evolution around those topics as well. So that's that chapter, right? Which brings me to the latest chapter. So eventually I decided I didn't want my doctorate, gave up on that. I didn't want to finish another master's degree in religious studies, and so I didn't finish that. And I wanted to continue my work as a therapist, and I eventually stopped teaching at Indiana University too, and just focused mainly on clinical work, which is what I do today. But, now in this current chapter, I'm still not finished. Over my life, starting when I was very young, I began exploring the answers to these questions first for myself and working out my own crap that I experienced early on, but then also because I want to be a good servant to others. I want to be a good guide, and I want to be competent. I want to be respectful. I want to act in alliance with my values. And part of that does mean figuring out how to understand and respect and support a diverse set of people that I work with. And knowing that religion and spirituality do play very prominent roles in a lot of people's lives, even if they're not prominent in the specific issues that people might bring to therapy, that I don't pretend that people are somehow magically not religious during the hour that I happen to be sitting with them in my session, right? So how can I incorporate that in a positive way? I continue to think about those issues. I continue to think about social justice values and how they are crafted by and shaped by, influenced by religious values. And I also think very deeply and continue to think a lot about the intersection of spiritual practice and mental health. And part of what that means for me is, for example, understanding how prayer is a stress reliever for many people, or understanding how contemplative practice or taking spiritual retreats or meditating or practicing mindfulness, these are quasi-religious or explicitly religious practices, but they do actually affect our identity. They affect our being. They affect our functioning. They affect our mental health. They affect elements of mental health, like am I anxious or not? And so I'm very interested in those. In the formal field of psychology, we mostly entertain these questions and explorations in the field of so-called positive psychology. But I read lots of stuff to this day to try to continue my own development in these respects. So my goal with this video was to just lay out a sketch of me from the beginning to today and how I got interested in issues of religion and spirituality and how that's evolved for me and how that provides the context for some of the stuff that I continue to think about and likely will make videos about for this channel. Obviously, I don't want to say all of that, all of what I've just said to you at the beginning of every video that I might make about something like what is prayer and how does it work in therapy, which is why I'm making this video. So So I can point to this video and just say, go there if you want to see the big long story, but here's the brief version. I've been interested in religion for a long time, right? So that's why I made this video. So anyway, if you like this content, feel very free to hit the like button below. It helps YouTube learn who to show my videos to. If you like the channel, feel free to subscribe, and I will see you in an upcoming video.